After my grandparents died in a sudden car crash, I barely had time to grieve before their lawyer dropped a bombshell. I was the sole heir to their $25 million estate. My parents and siblings didn't congratulate me. They didn't even look sad. They demanded I hand it all over for the good of the family. I said no. That night, they shoved my suitcase into the driveway and told me I wasn't welcome anymore. I moved into my grandparents' old house thinking I'd finally found peace. But the very next morning, I heard cars pull up. They were here to evict me, until they saw who was standing beside me. Their faces froze. And in that silence, I knew everything was about to change. Before I share my story, I want to know you are here with me. Just say, listening in the comments, or tell me where you are. I love hearing how far my story reaches. Sometimes even the smallest connection can make a story feel heard. Thank you. And now, here's my story. My name is Whitmore, and if you're new here, please hit that subscribe button so you can follow every chapter of this journey. Every view, every comment helps me feel a little less alone in this fight. The last afternoon of autumn light poured through the tall windows of my moonlit Grove Elementary art classroom, slicing into golden shafts that caught motes of pastel dust in midair. My third graders hunched over their desks, each intent on painting the fiery red leaves we'd collected that morning from the park behind the school. I moved between tables offering encouragement, holding up their work to the light. In my hand, as always, was the old wooden paintbrush my grandmother Dorothy had given me when I was 9. The varnish was worn smooth where my fingers had clutched it over the years. To anyone else, it might look like a relic that should have been replaced long ago, but to me, it was an anchor, a piece of Maplewood Manor I could carry everywhere. I was midway through showing Claire how to blend cadmium red into burnt umber when my phone vibrated in the pocket of my cardigan. I glanced at the screen and felt my stomach drop. Lucas Carter, our town's police chief, never called without reason. I stepped into the hallway, pressing the phone to my ear. His voice was steady but edged with something I couldn't name. Aurelia. There's no easy way to say this. Your grandparents, Dorothy and Clarence. They were in an accident driving back from Havenwood Bistro. He paused, and I clutched the paintbrush in my hand, like it could hold me up. They didn't make it. The hallway seemed to stretch and blur. From inside the classroom came the distant sound of children's chatter, high-pitched laughter, the occasional scrape of a chair leg, but it was as if they were on the far side of a tunnel. Lucas murmured, "It was clear-cut driver under the influence, no one else hurt." But something in the back of my mind snagged on the words clear-cut. Nothing about my grandparents' lives or their endings could ever be that simple. The funeral at St. Mary's was a study in contrasts. Havenwood's oldest church was crowded with townspeople who had known my grandparents for decades, neighbors, former employees of Whitmore Freight, old friends from the Historical Society. I stood near the back, watching my family perform their grief. My mother Celeste floated among the mourners like the hostess of a black tie gala, making sure her diamond earrings caught the light. My father Malcolm shook hands and accepted condolences as if closing a business deal. My younger brother Jasper scrolled absently through his phone, his thumb never stopping. My Aunt Miranda wept dramatically whenever a camera swung her way, only to stop abruptly the moment the lens turned elsewhere. I kept my place in the shadows, remembering summer afternoons at Maplewood Manor, fishing with Grandpa Clarence at the pond behind the orchard, helping Grandma Dorothy knead dough for apple pies, painting at the long oak table in the sunroom while she worked on her quilting. After the service, Lucas handed me a small box containing my grandparents' personal effects: the wooden paintbrush, a handkerchief embroidered with a single crimson maple leaf, and oddly, a receipt from Havenwood Bistro. The printed timestamp showed they'd left the restaurant nearly 40 minutes earlier than they were supposed to. I tucked it away, the question already lodging in my chest. Outside the church, Henry Caldwell, my grandparents' attorney and close friend, approached. He handed me a heavy cream envelope stamped with his firm's seal. 2 weeks from today. The reading of the will, he said quietly. Then, leaning closer, hold on to what they taught you, Aurelia. You're going to need it. As I turned to leave, Malcolm caught my elbow and lowered his voice so no one else could hear. Don't worry, the family will take care of everything. There was no warmth in his tone, only a claim of ownership. Before I could answer, Henry slipped me a second envelope, smaller, unmarked. Inside was a single scrap of paper in Dorothy's elegant script. When the world gets loud, listen to the maple leaves. I didn't understand it, but when I glanced toward the churchyard, a gust sent a swirl of scarlet leaves skittering over the grass. For the first time that day, I felt something stir, not comfort exactly, but the sense that this was only the beginning. The old brick building that housed Caldwell and Associates smelled faintly of polished oak and decades of paper. I sat at the long conference table, my grandparents' paintbrush resting in my lap under the table, as Henry adjusted his glasses and opened a thick leather folder. The ticking of a brass pendulum clock in the corner marked each second with a deliberateness that made the air feel heavy. Across from me sat my parents, Malcolm and Celeste Jasper, slouched beside them. Miranda and her husband Felix flanked the end of the table. None of them met my eyes. Henry began, his voice calm and precise. The estate of Dorothy and Clarence Whitmore is to be passed in its entirety to their granddaughter, Aurelia Quinn. He listed the assets: $7 million in liquid cash, $11 million in diversified investments. Maplewood Manor valued at approximately $5 million and 25% ownership in Whitmore Freight worth roughly $2 million. He cleared his throat before continuing. They have left no portion to other family members, stating in their own words, they have been supported amply during our lives and do not share the values we hold dear. The sentence landed like a shield in front of me, and at the same time like a target painted squarely on my back. Henry went on to outline a stewardship clause. For the first 6 months, you must maintain Maplewood Manor as a space for the community, hosting art classes, workshops, charitable events. Should you sell or close it for personal gain, the property will transfer to the Havenwood Educational Trust. My father leaned forward, his jaw tightening. She's a schoolteacher. She doesn't have the experience to manage this. Celeste's tone dripped with false concern. Sweetheart, this is an enormous responsibility. Are you sure you're capable? Jasper smirked. You could at least give me a little seed money for my startup. It's not like you'll miss it. Miranda smiled thinly. A house like Maplewood? It would be perfect for children. My children. I kept my voice steady. I'll honor their wishes. Henry's next words shifted the air. You should also know that the 25% share in Whitmore Freight comes with certain legacy provisions, specifically veto power over major strategic decisions. Your grandfather insisted this be preserved. Malcolm's face went rigid. He understood exactly what that meant. Someone muttered about contesting the will. Henry calmly reminded them that both Dorothy and Clarence had undergone medical evaluations just weeks before signing, confirming full mental capacity. We adjourned in tense silence. I stepped outside into the crisp air only to stop short. Tucked under my windshield wiper was a plain envelope, no return address. Inside, on a single scrap of paper, block letters spelled, "Do not go back to Cedar Lane tonight." I stood there on the sidewalk, the paintbrush warm in my hand, the maple leaves spinning down from the trees lining Main Street, and felt the unease settle deeper into my bones. Whatever storm my grandparents had foreseen, I was already standing in its first cold wind. The dining room in my parents' house was polished to a mirror's edge, the kind of shine that made you afraid to set a glass down. A lacquered table ran the length of the room, anchored by high-backed leather chairs that looked more throne than seat. The chandelier cast a cool golden wash across everything, a winter sun that warmed nothing. I was placed at one end, directly across from my father, like a defendant facing a judge. It wasn't an invitation. It was a summons. Malcolm folded his hands, his cufflinks winking. "We'll make this easy," he said, voice smooth enough to cut. "You transfer management of the estate to me, investments, the house, the company shares. In return, you keep 10%. $2.5 million. You'll never have to think about money again." Across the table, my mother smiled as if we were discussing flower arrangements. "It's a generous compromise," she said. "Practical." He sounded like a man finalizing a merger, not speaking to his daughter about the ashes of her grandparents. I kept my shoulders level. "No." Malcolm's jaw flexed once, then he leaned back unruffled. "You are the reason your mother and I never divorced," he said softly, as if confiding a kindness. "We stayed for you. For the appearance. That counts for something, doesn't it?" Celeste opened a thin leather folder and began to read item by item like a tax auditor. Tuition at Greenfield Academy. Summer intensives at the Art Institute. The car we co-signed. Studio classes. A laptop. Travel to college interviews. She looked up. "You've been an investment your entire life." Jasper chuckled into his water glass. $25 million won't buy you a family when you've walked away from one." I didn't recognize the voice that came out of me, low and even. "I haven't walked away from anything. I'm honoring what was asked of me." Malcolm brushed a speck of lint from his sleeve. "Then honor this too. The building on Cedar Lane. My investment company owns it. Your lease is terminated effective immediately. There's work being done, emergency repairs. You have 30 minutes to clear your things." The room tilted a degree, but I stayed still. "You can't expect me. We expect you to adapt." He raised his wine glass. "That's what adults do." The meal that followed was theater. Courses arrived and disappeared untouched. Words drifted over the table like perfume and left the same residue. When it was over, Celeste gestured toward the hallway. "You left some things upstairs in your old room." The room was preserved like a museum set. The pale quilt my grandmother sewed, a shelf of dog-eared art books, a narrow desk that still bore the shadow of a lamp. On the wall above the desk hung a small canvas I'd painted at 14, our apple orchard behind Maplewood Manor, rows of trees like friendly soldiers, a path cutting to the pond. I stood in front of it the way you stand in front of a mirror to see if you're still there. Malcolm came in without knocking. He reached up, lifted the frame from its nail with 2 fingers and set it against the wall by the trash bin. "This isn't good," he said. "It never was. You should have learned that by now." Something in my ribs went oddly quiet. It felt like watching a match pinch out between wet fingertips. I slid the canvas from the floor and held it to my chest. In the driveway, my phone vibrated. A new number. A single line. "If you need a place to sleep tonight, the key is waiting where the maple leaves fall." The words felt like an echo of my grandmother's note at the church. "When the world gets loud, listen to the maple leaves." The ache behind my eyes steadied into a decision. The hills outside town rose and fell under the last of the light. Wind threaded through the maples, channeling along the road, the branches whispering as if they recognized the car. I drove with my window cracked to let the cold in, to stay awake inside my skin. When I turned onto the gravel lane of Maplewood Manor, the tires made a sound that landed somewhere between a sigh and a welcome. Inside the house smelled like polished wood and dried apples. The library lights were off, but a stripe of moon across the rug led me straight to the long table under the windows. At its center sat a small wooden box carved with a maple leaf, the lid closed, but not locked. I lifted it. Inside lay a brass key with a maple leaf bow, a letter folded in half, and a small black flash drive labeled in my grandmother's hand for A. I set the key in my palm. It had the clean weight of something made for a single purpose. I opened my laptop and watched my face appear on the dark screen, tired, sharper around the mouth than I remembered. I didn't insert the drive. Not yet. I closed the computer and pressed my fingertips to the wood of the table, to the grain my grandfather had once traced while telling me the history of trees. I knew with the certainty that comes only when the ground shifts under you that whatever started here would not be undone. Dawn found the east-facing bedroom without knocking, spilling a clean light over the lace curtains and across the long dresser where my grandmother used to line up buttons in old jelly jars. In summer, I used to wake to my grandfather's rooster on the far side of the orchard, a sound that meant waffles and a day too big for shoes. This morning, the only sound was the house settling itself, beams easing, as if they remembered how to hold. I carried a mug of tea to the library, set the paintbrush beside my laptop like a talisman, and slid the flash drive into the port. The folder opened with clinical efficiency dates, Times camera labels, a list of files from the interior security system, and the small vault room off the study. My grandmother had never trusted locks alone. She trusted documentation. The first video fed in grainy black and white, the camera mounted high in the corner of her bedroom. The timestamp put it at the evening after the funeral when the house was supposed to be empty. The door opened and my father stepped in with my mother and Aunt Miranda at his shoulder. They moved like shoppers on a private tour. Celeste went directly to the antique wardrobe, sliding open the drawers with quick, practiced hands. She paused, lifted a string of pearls to the light, then tucked them into her purse without even trying them on. Miranda rifled a jewelry box, her face set and joyless. Malcolm crossed to the nightstand where my grandmother kept a cedar box of letters and keys, flipped through as if scanning for a passcode. I stopped the video and breathed until the room came back into focus. Then I clicked the next file. The library again, later that night. Jasper wandered into frame with a bottle in one hand, his jacket unbuttoned. He stood at the glass case where my grandfather kept his pocket watches and old train tags, small things that meant time and distance. Jasper glanced over his shoulder, opened the case, and slipped a silver watch into his front pocket, the metal flashing once as it disappeared. I clicked the third, the vault camera tight angle. My father stood with a notepad reading the spine labels of ledger books, snapping phone pictures of account numbers through his fingers. He never touched the cash bag in the bottom drawer. He didn't need to. He was there for the map. I sat back. It wasn't shock. It was a strange relief, like watching thunder finally break after hours of pressure. The drive held more than video. There was a folder of scans. I opened the first and met my grandmother's handwriting. She had labeled each entry with a date and a name. Requests from Malcolm for a bridge loan to cover a real estate sure thing. A list of emergency expenses from Celeste that included a gala dress and a club membership jewel. A note about Jasper's temporary startup capital that had never been repaid. Beneath one entry, she had added a line to me that must have been written with a steadier heart than mine. If you are reading this, our preparation time is over. Remember, truth is the strongest shield. At the bottom of the folder, a document titled, "For When the House Is Not Safe." It referenced a cottage at the edge of the county, a place called Pine Hollow, held in trust in my name. The words were simple. If Maplewood is compromised, go here. Keys with Henry. Use only if you must. I pictured a single-lane road and a porch light. I pictured silence that did not have to explain itself. A knock at the doorway brought me back. Mateo Rivera stood there with a thermos and 2 paper cups. He had been my grandparents' house manager for 15 years, a steady presence who knew which floorboards sang and which doors stuck. "You've been up a while," he said, setting the cups down. In his other hand, he held a neat stack of papers. "I thought you might want these. Copies of my employment records from Whitmore Freight and a letter Mr. Clarence wrote you. He told me I could give it to you when it felt right." I slid a chair out for him. "It feels like the middle of a storm. Dorothy used to say, storms show you which trees have the deepest roots." He nudged the thermos toward me. "Eat something today. Even a muffin." I laughed, which came out sounding like it had been in storage too long. He nodded toward my laptop. "You saw it then." I did. I told him about the pearls, the watch, the ledger photos. He listened without interrupting, his hands resting on the table as if to keep it steady. "Dorothy told me you would need all of us," he said. "That's what she called us. The people who remember what matters." Before I could answer, he reached into his jacket pocket and unfolded a printed article. The headline shouted louder than the text: "Whitmore shock local teacher inherits $25 million estate." A half-smiling photo of me from a school fundraiser was cropped tight enough to make my expression look smug. The comments at the bottom were a fence line rattling in wind, some kind, some cruel, many calculating. "No one needs that much money. Good for her, the family sounds awful. Watch how fast she turns Maplewood into a private spa." I didn't need a byline to know who had fed the story. "Noise," Mateo said gently, tapping the page, echoing my grandmother's word. "It will come and go." My phone buzzed across the table, skittering on the wood. An unknown number again. "The key will be taken back before you can use it." I looked at the small brass leaf glinting near my elbow and slid it into my pocket. "Let them try," Call Henry Mateo said. "This afternoon. He'll want to document everything and he'll know the next steps." "I will," I said, though I already knew a meeting at Maplewood would be a start, not a solution. It wasn't enough to defend. I would have to gather the way my grandparents had gathered people into a community that protected more than one household could. I pressed my palm to the top of the wooden box, the carved leaf warm under my hand, and felt the plan begin to take shape, like a sketch that suddenly knows what it's going to become. The afternoon light slanted across the long table in the Maplewood Library, casting warm stripes over the old town map spread across its surface. Henry arrived first, his leather briefcase snapping open with a crisp sound, followed by Judge Margaret Ellison with her calm, deliberate steps, and Sheriff Lucas Carter, whose weathered eyes took in every corner of the room before he spoke. It felt less like a living room and more like a war room now, every object carrying the weight of strategy. I slid the USB drive across the table, my fingers lingering for a second before letting go. Henry pulled on his glasses, inserted it into his laptop, and began logging each file with the precision of a man who knew what a chain of custody meant in court. Lucas leaned in as the videos played, Malcolm and Celeste rifling through my grandmother's dresser. Miranda's hand closing around the strand of pearls, Jasper pocketing my grandfather's watch. His jaw tightened. Margaret flipped through the scanned journal entries, pausing at the meticulous notations of every loan, every demand, every date. She murmured that such a record could carry significant weight in civil court. Henry closed the laptop and met my eyes. "This isn't just about your inheritance. Malcolm is trying to rewrite the bylaws at Whitmore Freight to strip you of your veto power." "The vote is in a week." My stomach sank. That clause, my grandfather's clause, was one of the last shields between me and whatever they had planned. Henry suggested we go public with my intentions to take an active role in the company to channel its profits into local initiatives. "It locks your image in the public eye before they can tarnish it further," he said. There was a knock at the door. Lila Bennett stepped in, smelling faintly of cinnamon sugar from her bakery. She held out an envelope inside photographs of Malcolm and Celeste, leaving a charity fair early, slipping away to meet with a real estate broker. Proof they had little interest in the causes they claimed to champion. Henry's phone chimed with an email alert. His expression darkened. "They've filed for an emergency injunction to suspend your control over the estate," he said. "The hearing is in 72 hours. I gripped the edge of the table. Lucas suggested round-the-clock patrols at Maplewood. "They'll escalate," he said. "Count on it." As if on cue, Mateo, who had been locking up, reappeared in the doorway. "There's a fresh scratch on the back door lock," he said. I followed him to the rear hallway, peering out into the dark orchard. Just beyond the glow of the porch light, a shadow slipped between the trees. When I closed the library door behind me that night, the silence felt sharper, the air heavier. They weren't going to wait for the courtroom. And neither was I. The orchard was quiet, save for the faint rustle of leaves. Mateo's flashlight beam caught a series of shallow impressions in the damp earth shoe prints heading north toward the property line. We followed them as far as the weathered fence where they disappeared into the woods. I stood there for a long moment, the cold air sharp in my lungs, aware that the line between my inheritance and their intrusion was thinning. By morning, Henry was on the phone. "They've frozen part of your investment accounts," he said, his voice clipped. "It's temporary pending the hearing, but it's meant to cut off your cash flow." I stared out the library window at the maple trees, their leaves swirling in the wind, and thought about how suffocation didn't always come from a hand at the throat. It could come from a signature on a court order. The news feeds were already on fire. An article complete with a grainy, long-lens photograph of me raking leaves claimed I was spending the estate's fortune on lavish renovations. The image had been cropped to hide the trash bags of dead branches at my feet, making it look as though I were hosting some extravagant outdoor affair. Henry suspected a paid photographer. The comments were split between strangers defending me and others echoing my family's narrative. We met that afternoon in the library again: Henry Lucas, Margaret Sophia Delgado from Whitmore Freight, Lila, and Mateo. The consensus was clear: we couldn't show our hand too soon. The USB and journal would stay under wraps until the hearing. "If they think you've got nothing concrete, they'll get careless," Lucas said. Sophia's phone buzzed mid-meeting. She stepped away, then returned with a frown. Malcolm moved the shareholder meeting up. "Tomorrow afternoon. He wants the vote before your hearing." It was a calculated play: trap me in the spotlight, corner me with hostile shareholders, and shape the narrative before I could speak for myself. I told Sophia I'd be there. If they expected me to walk into a room unprepared, they were wrong. As night fell, Mateo double-checked every lock, and Lucas stationed an officer at the front gate. I sat alone in the library, the lamplight pooling over my grandmother's journal. My eyes kept returning to one line: "When you feel the dark stretching long, remember the light never asks permission to shine." It was close to midnight when I heard a faint metallic click from downstairs, followed by the creak of a window latch. I set the journal aside, my pulse loud in my ears, and moved toward the staircase, each step deliberate. The air below felt colder, as though the night itself had seeped in. "Would you like me to continue immediately with Chapter 7, so the momentum and tension carry forward without breaking?" Morning broke with the sound of Mateo tapping on the window frame in the breakfast nook. He'd found fresh gouges in the downstairs latch, but the auxiliary locks we'd installed held firm. Lucas dusted the sill for prints and promised a forensic sweep. Standing there in my robe with a mug going cold, I realized I was grateful for the mundane powder on wood-numbered baggies, because it meant facts would have to be faced. By noon, I was walking into Whitmore Freight beside Sophia. The boardroom smelled like lemon polish and old strategy. My father was already at the head of the table, hand on a stack of papers as if they were scripture. Celeste sat at his right shoulder, perfect posture, pearls invisible under her collar but present all the same. A scatter of directors, some I'd known for years from company picnics, some I'd only ever seen in annual reports, watched me take a seat. The room felt less like a meeting and more like a sentence waiting to be handed down. Malcolm opened briskly. "Item 1, he said, sliding a photocopy toward the center. $500,000 withdrawn from a company-controlled account within the past month, initiated by Ms. Quinn. He let the number hang like smoke. Funds diverted to personal projects. I kept my hand still on the folder in front of me. "Those funds were requested by me," I said, "as an advance for the Havenwood Educational Trust's scholarship pool, to be replenished from my personal assets after the estate clears. Here are the invoices, the transfer confirmations, and the acknowledgement letters from the bank and the trust." Sophia handed out copies, page protectors whispering as they slid across the table. One director cleared his throat. Another frowned into his glass of water. Malcolm hardly looked. "Perception is reality," he said. "And the reality is that our company is being tied to a sentimental vanity project." "I'm tying it to the town that built this company," I said. "To apprenticeships in our shops? To training programs for kids who want a life here? to updated safety standards and a conversion plan for a greener fleet. The community is our engine. Investing in it isn't a vanity, it's fuel. Sophia clicked to a short deck showing pilot partnerships with the tech school, early quotes on hybrid rigs, and projected savings in 3 years. A few heads lifted. Questions followed about costs, about timeline, about brand goodwill when your trucks are seen at food drives, instead of only at loading docks. The edge in the room softened by a degree. We moved to the bylaw vote. My father's proposal was concise. Eliminate the legacy veto my grandfather had written, replacing it with a simple majority threshold. Hands rose. For a breathless second I thought he had it. Then 2 younger directors asked for a delay to review liabilities. A third surprised everyone by abstaining. The motion failed to carry that afternoon. Malcolm's smile didn't crack, but his knuckles blanched on the rim of his glass. When the meeting adjourned, I stepped into the corridor feeling wrung out and strangely lighter. Celeste appeared from the side like a shadow learning to speak. She stood too close, and her perfume made the hallway air feel thinner. "You think you've won something," she said, voice soft as felt. "We will take back everything, including what you haven't thought to guard." I met her eyes. "You already took what didn't belong to you," I said. "That door is closed." Her mouth curved in a smile that wasn't a smile. "Doors can be removed." Back at Maplewood, the house looked as if it had exhaled after holding a breath. The porch light came on with the early dusk. Henry was waiting in the library, coat still on, a folded notice in his hand. "They've succeeded in moving the hearing," he said. "First thing tomorrow." For a long minute, none of us spoke. Lucas stood by the window. Lila set a plate of cookies down with an unnecessary gentleness. Sophia leaned her hip on the table like she was bracing a ship. I felt the slow, steady rise of my own breath, the way it had in classrooms when 30 children looked to me to decide whether a spill was a disaster or a cleanup. I picked up my grandmother's paintbrush and let it rest across my palms like a baton being passed. "Okay," I said. "Then tomorrow we stop whispering." I slept, if you could call it that, in fragments, the night stitched together by the distant patrol car rolling past and the small, reassuring creaks of a house settling deeper on its foundations. When the alarm trilled, the sky was gray, and the maples were still like an audience waiting for the curtain. The municipal courtroom was built for zoning disputes and parking tickets, not for a town's appetite for spectacle. Still, the benches were packed, and people stood along the walls, employees in Whitmore jackets, parents from the elementary school, neighbors who remembered who helped shovel their driveways after storms. At the front table, I sat between Henry and Judge Margaret Ellison. My fingers closed around the paintbrush under the edge of the table like it was a grounding wire. Opposite us, my family arranged themselves like a painting. Malcolm in a tailored suit that suggested inevitability, Celeste composed into compassion. Jasper bored Miranda tight with indignation, Felix quiet in a way that read as complicity. Their attorney rose and walked the court through a portrait of me as a sentimental amateur unfit to manage anything more complex than a classroom. He spoke of imprudent spending and erosion of corporate value, and a concerning detachment from the realities of business. He said they sought only to protect a legacy I was in danger of squandering. Henry stood when it was his turn and asked the judge's permission to present a series of exhibits. The lights dimmed slightly as the clerk rolled out a monitor. The first video flickered on the camera in my grandmother's bedroom, the timestamp clear, the faces unmistakable. Celeste opening drawers, lifting the pearls, slipping them into her purse. Miranda riffling through jewelry, eyes scanning like a cashier taking inventory. We watched in silence. The only sounds were a few gasps and the hiss of someone drawing breath through their teeth. The next file played the library, my grandfather's glass case. Jasper's hand dipping, the flash of silver vanishing into his pocket. The final clip showed Malcolm in the vault room flipping ledger covers, photographing account pages. When the screen went dark, the courtroom stayed silent, a silence heavy enough to be measured. Judge Ellison spoke clearly. "Proceed." Margaret read from my grandmother's handwritten pages, each entry a small, precise record that added up to a ledger of character. Dates, sums, reasons that turned out not to be reasons. Short lines in the margins where Dorothy spoke to me directly, reminders about kindness, about accountability, about what money was for. When Margaret finished, the judge turned to me. "Ms. Quinn," I stood. My voice surprised me by being steady. "My grandparents didn't raise me to be impressive," I said. "They raised me to be useful. Maplewood is not a trophy. The shares in Whitmore Freight are not a lever for vanity. I'm here to do what they asked, keep this house open to the town, invest in the people who make this place a home, and run our share of the company with a conscience." Lucas called Mateo to the witness stand. His testimony was simple. He had seen members of my family going through rooms after the funeral. He had overheard comments about taking everything back, about Maplewood being a casualty if necessary. He answered without embellishment, which landed harder than outrage would have. My father's attorney tried to pivot to abstractions about fiduciary duty, but the room had already reoriented around something more concrete than rhetoric. When the judge delivered her ruling, her words were crisp as winter air. The petition to suspend my control was denied. The will stood as written. Items removed from Maplewood were to be returned within a week. An order barred my family from the property for 1 year absent written permission. For a heartbeat, no one moved. Then the noise returned in a wave, relieved rustling. A few claps quickly quelled the scrape of benches as people stood. I turned to my father. "This legacy isn't for more cars or bigger houses." I said, not loudly, but the words carried. "It's for holding on to what's good and multiplying it." His mouth tightened. He looked past me toward the exit as if the door would present itself as a solution. Outside, the wind had picked up. Leaves skittered over the courthouse steps, their dry chatter like whispered congratulations or warnings, I couldn't tell which. Henry squeezed my shoulder. Margaret smiled without softness, the way a strong rope looks beautiful, because you trust it not to break. Lucas tipped his head toward the patrol car, a reminder that safety could be practical, not just hoped for. Mateo handed me my coat and the thermos he'd brought, the lid warm against my palm. As we walked down the steps, a girl from my art class darted from the crowd to hug me around the waist, then scampered back to her mother. I watched her go and thought about the line in my grandmother's journal that had kept me awake the night before. Light doesn't ask for permission. It arrives and does its work. The maples along Main Street let go of a fresh flurry, and the leaves lifted, hovered, and fell, covering the sidewalk in a new layer of color that felt for the first time in days like a beginning rather than a burial. The morning after the hearing, Maplewood felt different, as though the house itself had taken a deep breath and was finally exhaling. Sunlight poured through the line of maples, casting gold patterns on the library rug. The air smelled faintly of apples drifting in from the orchard, sharp and sweet at the same time. Mateo appeared at the doorway holding an envelope so worn it seemed on the edge of coming apart. "Found this in a hidden compartment of Mr. Clarence's desk," he said. I took it carefully, feeling the brittle paper, the way the edges curled inward. The handwriting was my grandfather's, steady and deliberate. He wrote about Maplewood not simply as a home, but as a seed field, a place to plant opportunities in people who would carry them forward. If you're reading this, he'd written, you've crossed the largest threshold, keeping yourself whole in the storm. Tucked inside was a set of documents detailing an untouched investment, $2 million placed years ago into a community trust for Havenwood, completely unknown to the public. Henry looked at the papers, his eyes narrowing in appreciation. "This," he said, "will anchor everything you've built in the eyes of the town." 2 days later, the Havenwood Town Hall filled with reporters, local officials, and neighbors. I stood at the podium, the paintbrush I'd carried for months resting in my jacket pocket. I announced the formation of the Dorothy and Clarence Whitmore Educational Fund, using part of my own inheritance, and the trust to provide scholarships, renovate the school's art room, and fund trade apprenticeships. People rose one by one to share stories. Sophia told of the loan that saved her family's store after a fire. Lucas spoke of a scholarship that put him through the police academy. An older man in the back, a retired Whitmore freight driver, recalled my grandfather handing him enough cash to start his own delivery service when his wife fell ill. Their voices knit together into something larger than a press release. It became a public ledger of quiet generosity. By the end of the week, the stolen items were returned under police supervision: the pearl necklace, the silver watch, the bound ledgers. I decided they wouldn't go back into vaults or drawers. Instead, I cleared the east parlor and began setting up the memory room open to the community on weekends. While cleaning the pearl clasp, my thumb caught on a hinge that gave slightly. Inside was a tiny scrap of paper folded with impossible precision. My grandmother's looping script read, "The most valuable things aren't in the safe. They're in the heart of the one who keeps them." I stood in the stillness of the parlor, hearing her voice, as if she were leaning over my shoulder. That evening, I locked the memory room, the light slanting through the high windows, casting amber over the floor. On the key ring, the reflection of the maples shifted and shimmered. Maplewood was ready for what came next. 6 months later, the orchard rang with laughter. Children darted between rows of apple trees, baskets swinging, cheeks flushed from the crisp air. In the basement of Maplewood, now converted into a workshop and art studio, brushes clicked in jars and the smell of clay mingled with cider. I still taught at Moonlit Grove Elementary, my afternoons ending in the hum of the community gathered under Maplewood's roof. That spring, the first scholarship recipients had been selected, and, now, in the fall, we celebrated them in the Havenwood Hall. Photographs of my grandparents lined the stage, flanked by student artwork, bright portraits, landscapes of the orchard, and collages of the town's landmarks. One scholarship went to Isabella Cruz, a 17-year-old with the same glint in her eyes I'd once carried when I dreamed of becoming an art teacher. She took the microphone and spoke about her aunt who had received a scholarship from my grandparents decades earlier. That gift, she said, had pulled her family out of a spiral of hardship. As she spoke, I felt a quiet click inside me, the circle closing and opening again in the same motion. Letters began arriving in my mailbox from my family. Malcolm proposed partnering with the fund. Celeste left a voicemail suggesting reconciliation for the good of the community. Jasper asked for a loan to launch a business idea. My responses were the same: any relationship would need to be grounded in mutual respect and shared values. None of them replied again. Mateo, on the other hand, became part of something truer. His family joined us for Sunday dinners alongside Henry, Lila, Sophia, and a handful of neighbors who had woven themselves into my days. We called ourselves the family. We chose a phrase that felt as solid as the beams in Maplewood's attic. By late October, the orchard was fully restored, the bare patches filled in, the trees heavy with fruit. The children helped paint new benches and birdhouses, learning how to prune branches and test for ripeness. On one afternoon, golden light filtering through the leaves, I stood among them and let the wind carry the scent of ripe apples around me. Before the season turned, I walked the short path to the cemetery. At my grandparents' headstone, I set down a basket of apples and a watercolor of the orchard I'd painted at 10 years old. My voice stayed low, but I knew it would carry where it needed to. Money is a tool, I said. Legacy is what we plant in people's hearts. You planted. Now it's my turn. The leaves rustled overhead as if in answer, and for the first time I didn't feel like I was standing in the shadow of their story. I was standing in its sunlight.